Hello, Mark Cunningham at Grace Property Management. So a question we've been hearing more often recently from our real estate investor clients is this idea of, hey, Mark, what is cash for keys? I've been hearing more about that. What is it and does it really work? And just kind of explain why we may want to lean into that in those cases. So definitionally, the concept for a real estate investor as it relates to cash for keys, and it's always been around, but it kind of basically means this: it's paying money, like you as the landlord, you as the investor, you are paying money to a non-performing tenant, a tenant who's not paying rent. Why? In order to regain possession of your property. Now, you may think, well, Mark, that doesn't make any sense. Why in the world would I pay money to a non-paying tenant to get my property back? That's completely illogical. Well, let's just take a step back here just for a moment, and let's look at through the concept, through the lens of that worst case scenario. A real estate investor's worst case scenario is you put a tenant in the property and the tenant doesn't pay rent and the tenant doesn't move, and what do you do? What do you do when you're stuck in those situations? Well, remember, if you find yourself in that unfortunate situation as a real estate investor, you have two goals. You have two tracks that you're walking down at the same time with that non-paying tenant. Goal number one is to either get payments, and if you can't do that, then goal number two is to get possession. Those are the two things. You have to accomplish one of those two things as a real estate investor with your tenant. Either you have to get payment, get them current, or if they can't do that, if they're unable to do that, if they're unwilling to do that, then you have to get possession of the property back. So when we find ourselves in these rare circumstances, and they are rare, this does not come up very often, but when it does come up, what we explain to our tenants and our residents is, listen, you can stay and pay, or you can not pay and move, but you can't not pay and stay. That's not the option. So stay and pay, great, we love that to happen. If you can't pay, we understand if you have to move, but you can't not pay and stay in the property because it's untenable to a real estate investor. They still have to pay their mortgage, they have taxes, they have repairs. That's a recipe for disaster for a real estate investor if you have a tenant who's staying in your property and not paying. And this has been more common the last couple of years with the COVID stuff going on as it relates to the legal process, which has really come to a screeching halt in many places here. So you say, well, when would I want to consider, when would I as a real estate investor want to consider giving money to my non-performing tenants to have them vacate the property? And there's a couple instances when I think this is worthy of consideration. Number one is if the eviction process is extremely costly. Now we have to look at this through the financial lens here right now, because you're thinking, well, Mark, I'm a principled person. I would never pay a non-performing tenant money when they should be paying me money. That doesn't make any sense. Well, if we look at it through the lens of a purely financial transaction, because it's an investment, if the eviction process is going to cost you, as it does in many places, a high dollar amount, it may be more economical to pay the tenant a lower dollar amount to have them vacate the property. Why? Because remember your goal. Your goal is to get possession of the property back. That's the goal. And we've seen eviction costs just continue to increase dramatically. Just in Colorado again, this current month, the eviction costs are going way up. It's costing a landlord and a real estate investor a lot of money to go through the legal eviction process. Number two is if the eviction process takes a long time. So if we could get in a time machine and go way back a decade or 2 decades ago, the law was pretty clear at that point in time. And if a tenant wasn't paying rent, the way the laws in most states were set up is you could get a relatively fair and speedy process to either get receipt of funds or to get your property back. Well, that's been slowing down continually, and it continues to slow down. In Colorado right now, the legal eviction process to go through and to actually get your property back if a resident is not paying rent is on average about 90 days. So 3 months, that's a long time. It's a quarter of a year that you're going to be sitting on that property with the non-paying tenant. You're still paying your mortgage and everything else, waiting for this to work through. And these things can easily extend out well beyond that. Number three is if the tenant simply refuses to move. It's very rare, but sometimes it happens that a tenant will say, gosh, I'm not going to pay and I'm not going to move. Come get me. What do you do in those situations? Because if you find in that situation that it's going to be very expensive to go through the legal process and it's going to take a long time to go through the legal process, well, that's when you may want to consider what we're talking about here. This concept of cash for keys. I have real estate investor friends in California, for example, who have told me they have tenants in their property that have not paid rent for over 2 years, 24 months, and they're not able to go through the eviction process because it's so locked down in parts of that state. So they're sitting on a non-performing tenant, non-paying tenant for over 2 years. Those are the kind of situations where these types of things arise as an option, Now, if you as an investor are saying, Mark, this is ridiculous. You're asking me to potentially pay money to a tenant who's supposed to be paying me money. It's immoral, it's illogical, I would never do that. I understand that train of thought, but let me offer you 2 considerations on this. Number 1, as an investor, you have to focus on the financials. You have to remove yourself from the emotional side of this and focus on the financials. Because if it's going to cost you, let's just make up numbers here. If it's going to cost you $3,000 in legal fees and it's going to cost you another 6 months in missed rent, which is going to be thousands of dollars, and there's potentially more damage to the property that you're going to have to come in and do. So at the end of the day, you say, well, gosh, I can go through the eviction process, but it's going to cost me $10,000 in eviction expenses and legal fees and court costs and in missing rent. Or if I could pay the tenant a little bit of money just to get them out, economically, which one makes more sense? And number 2 consideration, as an investor, you have to focus on the goal. You have to focus on the goal. As painful as it may be in these rare situations, to go to a non-performing tenant, a tenant who's refusing to pay you rent, and say to them, hey, I know you're refusing to pay me rent money that you owe me. How about if I pay you money to give me the keys back to my property and you can take this money and go somewhere else? That's a hard thing to do. I understand, but we have to keep our goal in mind. It's not an ethical issue, it's a practical issue, because you have to do what is practically makes sense and what is practically the goals financially of your property, which again is to either get the tenant to perform, to pay rent, and there are so many rental assistant agencies right now. It's never been easier for a real estate investor, for a landlord to collect a rent from these rental assistance places because they're very generous in helping with tenants. So this is a rare situation that comes up. Most tenants are very good folks. They do pay their rent. They don't want to be difficult. But when you find yourself as a real estate investor with your back to the wall in one of those worst case scenarios where a tenant is refusing to pay rent and refusing to vacate the property, that's when a cash for keys concept is worth considering. If we can be a resource, we're happy to do so. Reach out to us at Grace Property Management. Rentgrace.com is our website. We have resources. We're happy to help in any way we can, whether you're a resident or a real estate investor.